All right, everybody, we are live. This is Unblocked live every Mondays and Wednesday afternoon. My guest today is none other than Bret Weinstein. Welcome to Unblocked Live. I'm Jeremy Lee Quinn. My guest today is Bret Weinstein. He's an evolutionary biologist and former Evergreen professor, and we've had a chance to talk in previous times on his Dark Horse podcast. He comes to Unblocked Live to talk about this thing called cancel culture. It may or may not, from what I read, be actual. Ladies and gentlemen, Bret Weinstein is on the show. Welcome.
Hey, Jeremy. Thanks for having me.
Hey, thanks for being here. So the latest headline that I saw was on the floor of Congress. A representative said, "Stop talking about Dr. Seuss." That was yesterday. Today, I'm looking at the one of the musicians for Mumford and Sons apologizing profusely about complimenting a book written by somebody who you know, Andy Ngo, who is from your area in the Pacific Northwest. And it seems that just saying that the book was brave has set off a pattern that I have come to dub the Twitter to tabloid pipeline, where we get these Twitter storms that are somehow making it into publication, and we see real live results, it appears. What's your first reaction to the sort of constant barrage that we're getting of these type of stories?
Well, it's clearly about something, and I think the problem is it's very easy to focus on the content of each of these stories and try to parse whether the person who's being canceled actually did anything offensive or any of these things. But the real story is the larger pattern, which is that something is wielding a tremendous amount of power, and it is able to dislodge people that it dislikes or to force them to capitulate and start speaking in a way that is consistent with this new ideology. And that is tremendously frightening, and I think also surprising. It's a lot of power, and it is being used to advance perspectives that are extremely radical and in many ways strange.
The strange part for me is that there's no conversation. That journalistically, when we look at headline to headline, the use of the technique of labeling somebody, just making a pronouncement that this person, and it is somewhat problematic. And then you have persecution by free association. Well, this person said something about this person, which says something about apologizes for this. And this persecution by free association is exactly what I think, and I'd like to get your take on it, what hit Gina Carano. And among a Star Wars fan base that has done this before many times, and I mapped out those tweets back to tweet zero, and it's surprising to see how 4 tweets that are allowed to sort of snowball and get thousands of likes all of a sudden inspire a group of publications, web publications, and the Daily Beast seems to come up consistently in all of these situations. They are somehow getting comments and talking to people. We also have the new editor-in-chief for Teen Vogue, who they're looking at tweets that she authored back in, I think it was 2011, 10 years ago when she was a teenager. And these stories are becoming appropriated, because if there's a trending wave and there's not much time, well, you just take what that person said and you just pull the same terminology, whether it's true or not, and you put your version out. Now, one thing that I'd like to get your take on, I published an article myself, and I went to retweet the article that I had written. It was a UK publication, Spiked, that did my sort of overall final report, as it were, of the last 8 or 9 months. When I wanted to retweet, Twitter said, "Are you sure you want to retweet this? Like, you haven't read this." And I was like, "Well, I wrote it, but but so I don't have to." But the thought that came into my head was, how often is this happening? That people aren't reading they're tweeting. And if you're the Daily Beast and you're Rolling Stone and you're Newsweek and you look at the numbers and you say, well, people aren't even reading this. They're just retweeting it. All that matters is that we get the first paragraph and the headline exactly like the last person, and then nobody's going to read it anyway. That
You're right.
scares me.
And it's amazing how frequently, when you actually dig in, you discover that the claims are meritless. Or what I find, particularly in recent times, is that you'll very frequently have a story reporting on the cancellation of some person for some behavior, and it will simply be asserted that they said things that were troubling, and then the whole story is about the cancellation. And my feeling is actually the most important part of the story is that you include the thing that they said so that I can evaluate myself whether it was actually troubling. And the reporting of the fact that it was troubling or controversial without the reporting of the content itself leaves us as essentially passive consumers of anger and vitriol. And you're right. Basically, it creates a formula for punishment. But it is also worth pointing out there are the stories that we know, the Gina Caranos, and then there are all the people who get the message and curb their own behavior, whose names never become known, and the things that they might have said never get said, which then gives us a very false impression of what people actually believe.
I see. But I mean, the Gina Carano story was so interesting to me because when I retraced everything to tweet zero, the very person who was helming the persecution run had been involved in previous efforts. And to get it going, she replied to an old thread from just a few weeks ago where all these other people were alerted, and it took off from there. And not only that, but the actual talking points, which were Republicans and Holocaust, those two words don't appear in the post that she shared. What she shared wasn't authored by her. A lot of people don't even know that she was not the author. That another podcast had posted something, she had screenshot it, and then she posted it. And you could see that other podcast logo is right there. Now, all these intricacies aren't even talked about, aren't even discussed. The content itself isn't even discussed. I mean, some people, Barry Weiss wrote about it, and Ben Shapiro wrote about it. And the question was, well, is this unnecessary? Is this anti-Semitic? But those labels were thrown on without a discussion. And I think that both of them concluded something very different than what the Twitter mob was pushing. What was your thought?
I mean, in fact, I think, again, it is very easy to get sidetracked by the content of these battles. And, for those of us who are aware that there's something abnormal about the level of sensitivity and, the fact that that sensitivity is not universal. I can say things that other people cannot say and vice versa. But the important thing is to recognize that there is some force that has not only decided that it is entitled to dictate who is allowed to make a living, but has the power to drive people off the map through simple allegation. And of course, this is exactly the sort of behavior that the Constitution is designed to prevent. But the loophole is that the founders understood this hazard in the form of governmental abuses of power, but did not understand the ferocious power that online mobs and their support by tech platforms would have. If the founders had understood this, they would have protected us from it as well, because it's frankly just as dangerous, if not more dangerous, than governmental abuses of power. But we are left defenseless in this era because, frankly, it was impossible to conceive of such a thing.
Certainly. Now, we had a comment on the audio as I just want to say, I just turned it down a little bit, and so hopefully that corrects it. But please continue to ask us questions and give feedback. I really appreciate it. The thing that I woke up this morning to see was this banjo player from Mumford & Sons had issued an apology about having hurt people by approving of the book that we know as Unmasked. Now, in each of these articles, if you go from Rolling Stone, again, another repeat sort of common denominator, just like the Daily Beast, to the AV Club had a scathing headline in which they called him a right-wing troll. We don't get, with this consistent default to labeling, we don't even get discussion about what the material is. how it may or may not be controversial. Well, if it is controversial, please let's have a discussion about that. Is there something in the book specifically that is quote unquote hurtful or harmful? What is that? That discussion is withheld completely, I find extremely disturbing, because that means we're not even talking about anything. We're just following the lead of a label of someone calling somebody a troll and then somebody else saying that that's a provocateur, and then it's just a pile-on. It's a landslide. It's an online landslide that keeps hitting without fail.
Yeah, I mean, in this case, it's a little hard to tell whether people were upset really about what he said about Andy's book, or whether it was the fact of his banjo playing. But no,
everybody's a critic, right?
Everybody's a critic. Yeah, no, the banjo is just an instrument that's always safe to make fun of, although it's actually quite a cool instrument. But nonetheless, yes, there's something very frightening about this. And I think the problem is we've skipped the part where you just simply get to be wrong, right? Like, let's say that there was something inherently wrong with Andy Ngo's book, and that this banjo player, whose job, frankly, is not to be a commentator on current events. He's a banjo player in a popular music group, right? Imagine that he was just dead wrong. Imagine that the book was offensive. Is he not entitled to be wrong and to realize that? Surely he has that right. Instead, he's going to be hunted like a witch for having said something that is not, in fact, as far as I know, not incorrect, but what it is heretical. Right. Andy is radioactive from the perspective of a certain political ideology. And they're entitled to feel that way about him. But the point is, they're actually wielding power on the basis of their assessment.
I was going to show the tweet. Sorry to pull away there so quickly, but I want to sort of see what this heresy is, so that we can take a look. Because oftentimes we have these conversations. I'm just sort of learning this to pull in tabs and take a look ourselves. So this is the great Mumford & Sons heresy. He wrote, this banjo player wrote, "Congratulations, Mr. Andy Ngo. Finally had the time to read your important book, You're a Brave Man." So this was the heresy, and I pulled the AV Club because their headline is so unjournalistic in its lack of objectivity. Mumford & Sons, Winston Marshall acknowledges he really fucked it up this time, is the headline. Now, I'm sure that gets clicks. It's edgy. And it goes on to say that Marshall tweeted in support of right-wing troll Andy Ngo, right? So I don't consider this journalism in any stretch of the imagination. There is nothing journalistic whatsoever about it. And as you go from story to story, we see this labeling, this habitual labeling being pulled out and recycled, whether he's a right-wing provocateur, whether he's a right-wing, whatever word it is, that's what your whole story is hinging on. That label, and associating this person with that label has become the be-all and end-all of journalism now, and that frightens me.
Well, I think it's also worth noting that the particular tweet in question actually evokes a prior cancellation from a different era in which the sensibilities were entirely distinct. It's the cancellation of Bill Maher in 2001, when he asserted that the terrorists who had attacked the World Trade Center were not cowards. It was common at the time to claim that they were cowards. And his assertion was they may be a lot of things, but cowards can't be one of them, right? Based on what they had done. And he lost his television show over this. He famously joked afterwards that he was the only person to have lost his job for failures associated with 9/11. And so in any case, that tells us something. What it tells us is that this desire to cancel in order to enforce a frankly false orthodoxy is not new. What's new is the particular constituency that is wielding it now, right? This particular sensibility about this moment, which makes Andy Ngo out to be untouchable, right? It's impossible to have a positive sense of Andy. And in fact, you are forced not to understand that he's courageous. And the fact is, he obviously is courageous, right? He has a tremendous number of enemies in his own city, a city in which the police are effectively not being utilized to protect people. So that's a courageous thing to do, whatever else you may say about it. And for this musician to simply comment on it in a positive way and to suffer an immense backlash is really all about making sure that people can't say things that are true.
Yeah, and not even have a conversation. Not even have a conversation about, well, what is heretical about the book, or what is, look, I've never had a conversation with Andino. Some people have asked me, well, what's the difference between your perspective and his? And quite simply, being somebody from the left, I have a much different cultural perspective than Andino, who has parents who escaped communist Vietnam. So my perspective is completely different. My parents met at UC Berkeley. So, if we're not considering this, if we're not even talking about differences in perspective, and if we're not even interested, and instead it becomes, this is whatever you think of his work. And I had this argument with Darrell Lamont Jenkins, who's a self-proclaimed Antifa activist on the East Coast. And he said, Andy No is a propagandist. And I said, well, he's a partisan. He's a partisan. But I can still look at stuff that's posted. And it's a source for me to look at material and see it, and then look even deeper and see if I agree with the way that it's being presented. So yes, partisan, perhaps. Everybody's biased. I think it's very clear that that Andy No is a partisan, but he said, well, no, you're being kind, propagandist. And I said, well, doesn't that make you, as an Antifa activist, a propagandist for the left then? So we had this interesting back and forth. When you have the conversations and people decide to talk to you, they can be interesting. But the thing is that one side is actively wielding power and therefore deciding to shut the other side down from having the conversation. That activist that I just mentioned, Darrell Lamont Jenkins, will not talk to me anymore, because then after that, an article came out in the New York Times, and he was then associated to having spoken with me. Therefore, he was somewhat complicit in the heresy of my work.
Yeah, interestingly, I was talking to, I hope I get her name right, Brittany Talissa King yesterday, who started a BLM chapter of her own, which she has now left because of her disturbance at some of the things that the BLM organization, the central one, has been doing. And I was talking to her about her encounter with Jordan Peterson, his material. And her report is that she encountered his material online before she encountered the accusations about Jordan Peterson, and that she found what she heard from him quite interesting and engaging and provocative. She said she didn't agree with all of it, but that it was very useful to her. And then when she encountered the stigma that was directed at Jordan, she was utterly shocked because she couldn't reconcile it with what she already knew. And the question was, well, if you had encountered these things in reverse, you never would have gotten to Jordan Peterson, because your assumption would have been that he was much different than he is. And so this, I think, is an indication of why these things work the way they do. Their purpose is not really to portray somebody as something that they aren't to anybody who actually has the information. The purpose is to prevent new people from finding them, right? So to the extent that Andy is so radioactive that even the obviously true claim that he is courageous for doing what he does is enough to trigger you to be deplatformed or scolded or mobbed or whatever, that is enough to keep people from not investigating. And, I've certainly encountered this myself, where the things that were said about me were preposterous, but they did keep a lot of people from ever figuring out the truth, because the point was, even to the extent that they might tune in and hear me say something that sounded reasonable, the point is they know that there's something hiding there that's absolutely unforgivable. And how much do you have to know before you know that's not true, right? You need to know, you need to have an exhaustive survey. And so nobody's going to do that. And that means that effectively the mob that is wielding this tool is able to decide who you can't afford to listen to, right? That's the thing, is they want to choose for you who you can listen to. And that means that you don't get a chance to engage perspectives that are not your own, to be challenged by them. And basically this is what causes thought to collapse into some kind of mind-numbing incorrect orthodoxy that is serving its purpose and not yours.
Now, the connection seems, I talked about Twitter to tabloid, and obviously it carries over beyond just your, Daily Mail or whoever is first to get it out, the Daily Beast. It carries over into these legacy, or I don't use that word. The word I use is establishment media. When you talk about Newsweek, when you talk about Rolling Stone, it's hard to argue against Newsweek and Rolling Stone just because, as far as, since my childhood, they've been around, and they wield tremendous reputation. So when these attacks occur, and that they are able to jump so effortlessly to these establishment publications and then enshrine the rhetoric. So therefore, Andy Ngo as right-wing, provocateur or whatever the word of choice is, that becomes enshrined in Rolling Stone, in Newsweek, in a way that is very difficult to, and as you said, I would very much like to have a conversation and understand and ask questions with Andy Ngo. I know that I haven't read the book yet. I've read, a little of it, but I know that this has to be this is like a very gingerly approach of trying to have a discussion about these, and it shouldn't be. A lot went on in the Pacific Northwest. Somebody's written a book about it. Well, then let's parse the content. But if you go online, the Antifa activists are doing mock readings of his book where they just laugh at it and dismiss it. And that subcultural, it's almost like a high school or the subcultural immaturity of we're going to call this without actually discussing the content itself. That is so pervasive that it doesn't just bleed into Newsweek and Rolling Stone. The Southern Poverty Law Center, who I was on their conference call at the beginning of February, and my question was effectively censored. I typed out a question. It was an online forum in which I said, how does the Southern Poverty Law Center address hate coming from the left? For example, October the 17th in San Francisco, December the 6th in Sacramento, and November the 14th in Washington, D.C., where these were unilateral attacks on conservatives. And the question was censored. The head of the Southern Poverty Law Center said, well, we have a question about hate from the left. Then the senior reporter told me I was offensive to ask about that, and started going on about another tangent that it was offensive for me to ask. I said, well, aren't we talking about hate? Now that same senior reporter was tweeting about Andy Ngo, and his tweets were that he's an objectively bad report. Like, it was just a slam tweet. And this is the senior reporter at the Southern Poverty Law Center. And the thing is people have shown up to Andy Ngo's house. People have spray painted "Kill Andy Ngo," and I've seen it. And so I asked him, isn't he a target of hate? And I asked him, I think it's bad for journalists to endorse ad hominem attacks on other journalists. Can you point out empirically where in the content you're disputing? And isn't he a target of hate? Blocked. I am now blocked from the senior reporter of the Southern Poverty Law Center. And this I find extremely disturbing, because not only was I censored, now I'm blocked. And
it's amazing. And it shouldn't matter what your political leanings are, but here is somebody unapologetically from the left talking about a reporter on the right and asking, is he not also the victim of hate? And that is beyond the pale. That tells us something about where we actually are. I also think it's important to say, in the context of Andy Ngo, I have some criticisms of him, which I have said to him directly. He's a friend of mine, and I have been very clear with him about the fact that I think we would all be better off, and he would be better off if he was more balanced in what he reports. That said, I frequently find myself, as a citizen of Portland, looking at his feed in order to figure out what's going on in my own city, because much of what's going on is simply never reported anywhere else. So let's say that there is a critique of Andy Ngo to be leveled, that there is a bias there that is unnecessary and counter to journalism. I mean, he's young. It's the kind of thing I would expect him to age out of eventually. But let's say that that's an accurate critique. Well, let's balance that with the fact that he is virtually the only person in the context of Portland who is giving an accurate report of where violence is taking place and what it is. And when I go to these reports, I find that it is a better measure of what's taking place in my own city than I get from our local papers. So, we have to balance what may be an accurate critique with the obviously valid fact of him doing important work that nobody else is doing.
Yeah, this is the discussion that I had with Daryl Lamont Jenkins, which is I can look at that feed and there are parts of information when they are uncut and when they play out in full that I can then, they're a jumping off point for me to find out more and to find out about a certain march or what's happened. Now, I think where it gets so adversarial is the posting of mugshots and so on, where people are claiming that is a danger. Now, mugshots are public information. That if you commit a crime, your mugshot is readily available to be distributed. That's part of how our system works. So until that changes, I don't know that anything, but the claim is that that there are so many white supremacists out there and there's so many people who are targeting each other that the distribution of this information puts people in danger. And then there are certain talking points which you see again and again. Well, he knows this person who's part of this group, or he is associated with this, and so forth. But again, none of that gets down to content, because even if somebody is ideologically more aligned with your enemy than somebody else, you still, or we as a society should still demand that we address the content itself and have specific criticisms and counter evidence if there is something that is presented that is empirically false.
Yeah, the mugshot issue is an interesting one. I must tell you, there's part of me that's uncomfortable with it. On the other hand, they are public documents, and at the same time that these mugshots are being broadcast by Andy, the system that is supposed to be prosecuting people for engaging in crime is overwhelmingly falling down on that job. So these arrests mean less and less. They do not mean that somebody is going to get their day in court and be punished if they've done something wrong, like break windows, light a building on fire, whatever they've done. There's an awful lot of the tacit acceptance of criminal violent behavior in the city. So I guess the point is, I don't know what the right thing to do is in a city that refuses to enforce the law against people who are reliably violent against citizens and businesses. I think we are in novel territory, and there's a reason that there's nothing illegal about broadcasting these mugshots, and that is because they are public. And therefore, to the extent that there were white supremacists looking for people, they have access to them already. So again, I'm not comfortable with it. If the system was working, I would advise Andy not to engage in this behavior. On the other hand, I don't know where it is people think we have landed, but we've landed in a dangerous situation in which people are effectively facing a revolving door when they are arrested for violent crimes.
And going beyond that, just the conversation that we're having right now, I mean, somebody could try to frame that as heretical. And I think that has kept me going in some ways to want to discuss this. So even if we're talking about the Teen Vogue editor-in-chief, who Teen Vogue surprisingly has this huge anarchist section, I think I mentioned to you on previous, so it's kind of not surprising that there would be some sort of action. And in these actions, 20 people wrote a letter. Now, this always gets to the Daily Beast first. It seems like they're the ones who published it or were quoted. 20 people write this letter to examine racism from 10 years ago, that she tweeted derogatory tweets that she I gather apologized for in 2019. So this has already come up once before. But then you get celebrities in on it, given rising perceived. I don't think we have the hate crime numbers for 2020, but the perception is that there has been a rise in hate crimes against Asian Americans, and therefore Olivia Munn, Daniel Day Kim, all these Asian American actors are getting together and making statements as well. It becomes a highlighted sort of these become online events, essentially. Now, nobody's called for her to be fired immediately. It just seems that everybody's raising this awareness, so to speak, and we're trying to figure out what happens next. But if you work in one of those institutions, let's say, that says, we have this letter we want everybody to sign, and you don't want to sign it, well, then what happens to you for thinking that this is unnecessary, or this is? And I'm curious also, somebody had asked about Clubhouse, that has Bret talked about what happened on Clubhouse? And I'd heard a little bit about this, and was that a microcosm event in some sort about how a room can essentially be taken over, and that trying to detract from this sort of current can land you in hot water? What was that about?
Well, so I'm caught in a little bit of a bind on this one, because there's nothing wrong with me talking about what happened in that room. But the reason that people are aware of what happened in that room is that somebody broadcast a recording of it on the internet. And that's against the rules. And frankly, I think in general, the rule that prevents people from broadcasting recordings of those rooms is a good one, that actually allows conversation to be freer, and therefore potentially in many circumstances to solve these issues rather than make them worse. But yes, given that this one is out in the world, it was almost literally a microcosm of what takes place elsewhere. It was a little room, probably, I don't know, several hundred, 1,000 people. And it was started by Michael Tracy. I was not there when he started it. I was not in any official way part of this room. I just walked into it to listen to what was being said. The room's title was something about, is Clubhouse too obsessed with wokeness, or something like that. And in my opinion, sitting in the audience, it was going quite badly. It was being managed in such a way that, frankly, there was all kinds of things were heating up, and instead of it was more heat than light, let's say. And at some point, someone persuaded Michael to grant moderator privileges to a person of color. And then I think the person who was granted the moderator privileges granted them to somebody else. And once you have moderator privileges, you can boot anybody you want off the stage or out of the room. So they booted Michael, and they booted every white person off the stage. There was about 30 seconds of people of color who remained on the stage protesting and saying that they wanted to continue to have a productive discussion. Those who made that point were ejected also, which left a stage full of people who then engaged in all kinds of obnoxious behavior. They were demonizing whites. They were demanding payment over Cash App. It's not for people who don't.
Payment for what? For just their thoughts?
Well, try this on for size. They were demanding payment for the education that they were delivering to whites in the room. That is, they were berating whites and making all sorts of claims. There was no claim too outlandish to be entertained in this room. I never heard anybody say, yeah, actually, that's not true. So all sorts of things were suggested, including that cities are constructed to make the hunting of blacks easy, things like that. So anyway, this room, or at least the leaders of it, were demanding that whites in the audience pay the black organizers, were those who took it over and became the organizers of this conversation, for education. That was what the ostensible explanation was. At some point, they noticed that I was in the audience. They started saying things about me. It happens that I had an invitation to come on the stage that somebody had directed at me left over from before the coup. So I clicked it and I went up on the stage, and they immediately asserted that I was, when I said that I was an evolutionary biologist, they said, "You're a eugenicist." I said, "No, I'm not a eugenicist. It's not the same thing." They accused me of, or they demanded to know if I was a white supremacist or a transphobe. I told them I wasn't. They immediately asserted that I was, and then ejected me from the stage. In any case, it's, on the one hand, not really a big deal, and frankly, not all that unusual for conversations in a place like Clubhouse. Clubhouse is still discovering what kind of platform it is, and I will say that the full range of conversations exists there. There are excellent conversations, and I've heard and participated in and organized conversations on race that are very productive there, but I've seen the exact opposite many times. So in any case, I would say it is important that we not oversimplify or extrapolate too much from what took place. But yes, the room you are describing was a microcosm of the same dynamic.
And you were allowed to remain in the room the whole time, or were you eventually booted?
I don't know the answer to that. I know that suddenly I disappeared from the room. I don't know whether that was because somebody kicked me out, or I also heard that it's possible that Clubhouse shut down the room. And it may be that the coup leaders shut down the room. I don't know. I have no insight on what went on behind the scenes. I know that suddenly I ended up out of the room, and that I didn't know of any reason for it.
Gotcha. Gosh. Well, the name of this podcast is Unblocked, and it's not a reference as much to the black bloc as it is just unblocking each other, not blocking each other, hearing each other out, trying to have conversations. This is an interesting question I want to present to you. Adam asks, speaking of Evergreen, if Bret could teleport back to Evergreen, what would he do differently? And that's a question that I'm curious. Is there anything in sort of that moment of self-introspection and looking back and knowing what you do now that you would have, how would have you approached things differently, perhaps?
Absolutely. There is something I regret. I was very careful about when I sent emails into my college, when I sent them to my faculty and staff colleagues. And in that process of being very careful, I wrote but did not send many of them, right? I was trying not to inflame things, so I sent a small fraction of the emails that I wrote. In retrospect, I should have sent them all, right? These things create a record of what's taking place, and the responses to them are quite telling. And because Evergreen is a public college, those things became available to the public through public information requests. And in effect, all of the emails that I sent and all of the responses that came to them allow the story to be understood historically in a way that it would not be understandable if I hadn't sent them. But if I had sent more of them, the story would be all the more complete. So that's my regret. As for the other things, there's always little things that I wish, there's a sentence here or there that I would clean up so that it was simpler to understand. There's one sentence that gets regularly quoted of mine that has too many phrases in it, and it would just be simpler if people were quoting a sentence that had a couple of phrases. But no, I in general, I think I did the right thing. I stuck to my principles throughout. I was clear about why. I didn't cower. I would do it very much the same way again, but with more documentation.
Would you change anything in regards to right-wing news sources that you spoke to, or how those may have come off or been easily, I guess, portrayed in another light?
Well, let's put it this way. There's actually, I don't even know if it's a regret, because there's something I don't know about my own story that if I could recover it would tell me whether I have a regret here or not. I went on Tucker Carlson's program. I have zero regret about that. The reason I have no regret about it is that no other national news organization was interested in talking about the story. And so it was necessary to go to whoever would talk to me at that level in order to get the story not to be fictionalized inside my local context. The entire movement on the campus was attempting to portray me in a false light, and the president of my college, effectively my boss, was fully participating in this. And in order to not allow that process to take place, in order not to be overwritten by a fictional version of myself, I had to take it in a context that they did not control. And the only one that was available to me was Tucker Carlson at first. So I'm glad he offered. I'm glad I went. Here's the regret. The channel sent a car to bring me to the studio. It arrived and we hit traffic and I was late. So the broadcast was already taking place at the time I arrived in Seattle. And so they literally handed me a microphone. I'm threading it down my shirt as we're in the elevator. My hair isn't brushed. I'm sweaty from running from the vehicle to the building. I get in there and they plunk me down in a chair in a room with no purse, no other people. And there's a camera in front of me. There's no screen. There are two eyes on a piece of paper that have been pasted above the camera to get you to look in the right place. And the next thing I know, I'm on with Tucker Carlson and he's asking me questions. Now, my colleagues gave me a tremendous amount of grief for the fact that Tucker said something that was false about the story. He effectively said that we whites had been forced off of campus, which was not true. We were asked not to come to campus, and we were asked that by administrators. It was not a simple request, do it if you like, don't do it if you like. It was coercive, but it was not a rule that we couldn't show up on campus. So Tucker made that error. And here's what I don't know. I don't know whether I heard him say that in the intro to the story. I had not yet been brought on. So I was sitting there. It's possible that that was piped into my headphone and I was listening and not paying attention because I'd just been dropped in this chair from the elevator and this is my first time on national television and all of that. Or it's possible that I didn't hear it and they brought me on at the moment that the interview started and I didn't even know that that had happened. But what I didn't do was correct it. Right? I didn't say, actually, Tucker, you said we were forced off of campus. In fact, it was a coercive request. If I'd said that, no regrets. If I didn't hear what he said, I can't have any regrets. If I did hear it, I know that I didn't intend to obscure it, and I know that I've never said it wrong. I've always said the correct thing. But, there is the possibility that I heard it, and if so, it would be better if it had been corrected. However, I will point out there's an addendum to this story. I took so much grief over not having corrected Carlson that I went back to Fox, must have been several weeks later, and I went on his program. He made the same introduction, and I corrected him. No one has ever mentioned it to me, never once. So frankly, I think the accusation that they were upset over my failure to correct Carlson was bogus to begin with. When I did correct them, it made no difference to them, and in fact, I don't even think it registered.
If one is a target, they somehow find a way. If it's not the one thing, then they might find something else somewhere else.
Absolutely.
And I know, I just published this piece, and I know I gave the editors so much grief. I refused to take any money for it, and part of the strategy there was it allowed me to be as difficult about litigating every single word, because for me this was 8 or 9 months that I was putting my photographs and my stance on it. And one thing that surprised me was how often sometimes changes would come back to me that would twist the character at one point. And I think the word supposed still sits in the article, and I tried to address this. It says supposed right-wing extremism, and I said, well, no. This was what I saw at the Capitol was right-wing extremism. Let's get that word out of there. But sometimes I have been surprised because with the New York Times article, which was called "The Truth About Today's Anarchists," Farrah Stockman, the author, didn't write that headline. And that was written by somebody
Mm-hmm.
in the web, department. And similarly, my piece was originally called A Culture of Extremists. And I was arguing, quite simply, we need to look at extremism holistically, because just like I've always said, just like Newton always said, every action has an equal opposite reaction, and that we need to approach extremism like that and have these conversations and not think of and as opposed to persecution, the culture of persecution that is persisting. But I was very surprised when my headline became something completely different, and I thought about it for a while, and I was like, okay, I guess it's not, totally egregious. But if we're in a culture where every word is being litigated and you're being said, hey, you said this one time 7 years ago, therefore where you have worked to and gotten to and arrived at is illegitimate because of this. That's why I think I was so anal and such a nervous wreck about just publishing the last 8-9 months of study. And it's a scary place to be in the sense that that we're going through everybody's history with a fine tooth comb.
Well, two things on this. One, I think the public understandably cannot appreciate the predicament of putting stuff into this world at any substantial rate. I know that for years after the Evergreen thing, every time I got in front of a camera or a microphone, I was effectively watching myself speak to make sure that I didn't say anything that a hostile entity could misinterpret. And it's very hard to do. It's not conducive to interesting conversation. It's a self-protective thing. And it's only a matter of time. If you put, hundreds of hours of conversation into the world, there will be things in there that if you edit them sound bad, no matter who you are, right? A hostile editor is a very frightening thing. But then there's the other question about things that people do say and then come to regret and apologize for. And what is the status of those things, right? And I suppose that there are things that might be so egregious that they would permanently taint my opinion of somebody, but those things are pretty few and far between, right? Somebody who owns up to their bigotry and gets over it is actually, in my opinion, an admirable person, right? And so in the case of the Teen Vogue editor, I actually couldn't find her exact tweets, but I got the gist of what they were by looking at enough reports. But my sense is, yep, they were bad. I admire somebody who recognizes that they're bad. And then we've got the case of Dr. Seuss, which is just such a beautiful illustration of this. I mean, literally, right? The man had bigotry that was very much of the moment, right? He had especially anti-Japanese bigotry during in the run-up to and during World War II, very common for an American. But he also, not only did he get over it, and not only did he apologize, but the lesson was important enough that he encoded it into Horton Hears a Who to give children the benefit, a book that he dedicated to a Japanese friend of his from after the war. And so my sense is, this is the bigotry that we find in early Dr. Seuss is exactly the opposite of something that should cause us to cancel him, right? It is the basis to actually fully understand the complexity of a human being, the fact that, our heroes are not pure, and that it is admirable when they behave as we would hope they behave in the face of the discovery of their own flaws. So what the hell are we doing canceling anything? You've got to leave the record so people can go back and figure out what they're supposed to do.
I agree. What's interesting about Dr. Seuss, much like Star Wars, is these, and much like the Teen Vogue editor, these are not the first passes. These are like second and third or fourth passes. One of the tweets that I found said, hey, this is the third time we have Gina Carano trending. Do you think they'll finally do it? The people who are getting in on it are well aware. This is not just that this Teen Vogue editor apologized 2 years ago, and yet we're doing it again is all too predictable. What with Dr. Seuss, did you know, I had missed this story, and I just learned this morning, that in the fall of 2017, the First Lady, Melania Trump, had given away or sent Dr. Seuss books to a number of libraries across the country. And one woman sent them back and said that and made points about Dr. Seuss and let's just call them activist points. A paper was then written in which they discussed Dr. Seuss and white supremacy, and it's one of these papers with a unusually long title, and when you get to the end of it, the conclusions are mind-boggling. And I kind of do, on one hand, I have that here and I could possibly read it, but on the other hand, it's just more it's more cancel porn in the sense of where these papers go to and how we're supposed to interpret the Cat in the Hat as a minstrel, as evoking minstrelsy and all of this. And so there's this is not the first go at Dr. Seuss.
Oh no, it's been coming.
It's been coming.
It's been coming. So that the business about there being this academic paper, which I have also looked at and is preposterous, not surprisingly, is I have a term for this. It's called idea laundering. And the idea is that certain ideas are nonsense, but if you can get a academic looking publication to say that they are valid, and that academic publication is in a field that doesn't have a method, right? If basically the point of the thing is to discover the conclusion that you fed in on the front end, then these things look to the casual observer like, well, I guess there are people who study these things, and I guess they've concluded Dr. Seuss is a white supremacist, right? Well, you can discover yourself in looking at the facts about Dr. Seuss that he is a guy who had some bigotry, got over it, and was the opposite of a white supremacist, right? He has many marks in his favor on this, not just simply his willingness to apologize, but the place he arrived in his life is the opposite of that. And so you can discover that. But if you want to play this game, then it's very convenient to have a scientific publication or a scientific looking publication that says, well, we've discovered the white supremacy and, sorry, but Dr. Seuss has got to go. So anyway, keep idea laundering in mind because it happens again and again.
And it's to retrace these cancellations. And again, now we're getting to a point where I see people on my Facebook feed saying cancel culture is a right-wing talking point. And now neither of us are right-wing, yet
Nope.
we've been on the receiving end, both of us, of essentially these online defamations that sort of come out of nowhere. I looked at mine, and mine came from anarchist publications that simply did not like what was printed from my work, and so they used the same labels: conspiracy theorist, right-wing troll. I was a right-wing troll all of a sudden, and as I told you before, by the next morning you're a neo-Nazi, and that's what happened in the Gina Carano thing too, because anti-Semitic was disgusting. All of these, it was a publication called Discussing Film was the first one with 100,000 plus followers to get the talking point that this was really disgusting. So they get 10,000. Everybody's rewarded 10,000 likes for their effort in the campaign. Here are your 10,000 likes with which you may display them on your pinned tweet. And that's essentially the collateral. That's all that people are getting out of this, and taking somebody down.
Yeah, I mean, it's incredible that people will betray their values for, I mean, it's not even a pittance, it's empty. But nonetheless, you're right. It's formulaic. It's often not the first pass at people. I think finally we are succeeding in facing down the accusation that if we are concerned about this, we must be right wing. Right? That's an old chestnut, and it's been very effective at keeping people who know about themselves that they are left wing. It's been very effective at keeping them from paying attention to those of us who are alarmed about wokeism. But I think it's finally dissipating, and people are realizing, it's hard to explain a Jeremy Lee Quinn or a Bret Weinstein as somehow right wing or a shill of the right wing, because actually their bona fides are pretty substantial with respect to their belief in progressive ideals, and therefore, what does it mean that they are concerned about this? That must mean this isn't a simple left-right issue. This is an issue of decency, and hopefully we will discover a lot of people waking up to the reality of the hazard of cancel culture because they do finally understand that it is effectively a nonpartisan concern.
Well, and I try to use some different words to address that, in the sense that I'm realizing that when a talking point gets out and it permeates with such, it replicates, pretty efficiently. And I realize that if I can't say cancel culture because everybody is just, somebody said it on the House floor yesterday, a representative that stop talking about Dr. Seuss, and we don't want to talk about cancel culture. This is a distraction. And yes, we do have all these other issues that we need to confront. But I have seen, and maybe the word persecution is more accurate to what I have seen, because in each of these cases, from Gina Carano to the editor-in-chief of Teen Vogue to, the New York Times reporter, Donald McNeil, these are all persecution trends. It's about taking this person down. And so if persecution is a better word, then I opt for that. The other term, I think it's okay to be woke. The issue that we're having is a kind of woke-tarianism, where it's not okay just to be woke. You have to be woke like at this level and be on board with taking the unwoke down. And so that's where I get very specific about what troubles me.
Well, I disagree with you a little bit on woke. And it's not that I don't understand what you're saying, because my recollection is that woke was a honorable and useful term until some point at which it changed. It became a moniker for something else. And like so many of these things, it is ironic in the sense that if there's one thing that seems to be true of the aggressively woke at the moment, it's that they appear to be sleepwalking, right? They do not appear to be awake. They appear to be on a mission and acting on autopilot. So I don't wish to denigrate the term as it used to exist, right? People who are aware of the struggles of others, I think in particular Black folks, are to be honored for that awareness, or to be at least recognized. But that's not what this is. Something else has taken it over. And so, am I against social? No. Am I against justice? No. Social justice sounds great. But social justice at the moment means a very particular set of beliefs that are actually antisocial and unjust. And so I have to oppose it, even though there's a certain price to it. If the woke revolution is a bunch of people who are actually asleep, even though it seems that I'm opposing people who are awake, I know that that's not what I'm doing. So persecution, I like it. It's an accurate descriptor. Maybe we need something like techno-persecution to describe this new dimension of the way it works, or something along those lines, or witch hunting, or I don't know what the term would be, but it has to be a combination of whatever this ancient instinct is to destroy those with wrong think in their minds. And it is fused with modern technologies that, frankly, nobody could have conceived of until very recently.
Now, last question, because I know you do have to go, and I want to ask one question from the shoes of, I guess, my own perceived adversary, as it were. I was thinking in terms of the senior reporter of the Southern Poverty Law Center and how my inquiries were labeled offensive. Now, and I like to think this is why the discussion itself can be so much more interesting than just the, you're blocked. I was interested in looking at hate crime statistics, that there's roughly 5,000 hate crimes, and they disproportionately affect African Americans and Jewish Americans. And so, and as I look at those, and then I think it's 60% and 40% of them are intimidation, but 60% of them are classified as aggressive assault crimes. And so when you look at that and you have a number that's like 1,000 or so that take place annually, and you are the senior reporter at the Southern Poverty Law Center, and you say to me that you fixating on this Antifa beating in Sacramento, or bringing it up that this couple was assaulted, that I am constantly mentioning, November the 14th and the unilateral attacks under daylight on the right and those who are leaving the rally. In the same way that we would probably look at police deaths and statistics. A study just came out that said that people on the left see people of color, they believe people of color are dying in the thousands annually due to police violence. And that's not the case. When we look at that, it comes out to about 1,000, and then it's broken down with whites as the majority of those who are killed by police violence. African Americans are disproportionately affected, and we can look at those numbers. So the argument that there is that, well, why do we fixate and am I doing that? If I put all this concentration when it comes to hate crimes on these one instances which are not reported, are not discussed nationally, but are a drop in the bucket compared to the, let's say, 1,500, assaults against, African Americans, or roughly or more annually, then how am I not embellishing the importance of what I have experienced and witnessed?
Well, this is in one way a simple problem, and in another way a very difficult one, because the simple answer is we have the tools to figure out how to calibrate our understanding of what's important and how significant it is, right? This is what statistical tools are for. Unfortunately, they have to be wielded very carefully, and we humans are wired so that we are very easily fooled, right? Fooled by patterns or things that seem like patterns that aren't, fooled by the tendency of media to concentrate on things that will fascinate us rather than things that actually affect us. And so anyway, we're prone to end up biased in an environment that is not representative with respect to what it shows us. Statistical and scientific tools are the key to undoing that. But the problem is, and again, one of these ironies of this woke revolution is that it is attacking the very tools that would allow you to figure out how significant something is, right? The claim that, blacks are being killed by the thousands by police is a claim that we can evaluate. And it turns out, as you point out, the numbers are wildly misunderstood by people, or their expectations are wildly too high, that blacks are disproportionately represented compared to their level in the population, much less disproportionately represented or not misrepresented or overrepresented with respect to their numbers of encounters with police, apparently. And then we can talk about why that is, right? There's a role that poverty has in creating crime, and that crime has everything to do, or at least a large amount to do, with why people encounter the police. And so there's a real discussion to be had. And what you would want are the facts so that you could evaluate what the causal agents were and therefore what might be likely to work and what is unlikely to work. But a movement that attacks science as white supremacist, right, that says that those are the tools of the oppressor and therefore we must abandon them, is effectively, it's plucking out its own eyes. And, frankly, to the extent it's forcing the rest of us to abide by these diktats, it's plucking out our eyes. And we can't afford that. We need to know what's going on before we even get to a question about what to do about it.
Bret Weinstein, thank you for being with us. I really appreciate it. And it's, as always, it's great talking to you. And thank you for being on this edition of Unblocked Live.
Thanks for having me. I enjoyed it. We'll do it again sometime.
I hope so. And folks, sorry we didn't get to many of the questions. We appreciate you being here. Please hit the subscribe button, youtube.com/unblockedlive if you're watching on other platforms, or we are streaming on my Twitter as well. So thank you very much, everybody, for being here. Bret Weinstein, and we'll talk again soon.
Great. Be well.